You've probably sensed something unsettling as you've moved through life. The issue isn't that people are impossible to understand. The real issue is that they rarely remain consistent. A person tells you they care, yet little by little their actions begin to drift away. Someone promises commitment, but the moment loyalty becomes inconvenient, they quietly disappear. Someone smiles warmly, reassures you with confidence, agrees with everything you say, and later behaves as though those words never existed. The deepest pain is rarely the betrayal itself. It is the realization that you never expected it. That moment when everything suddenly makes sense, yet somehow you failed to see it coming. Most people believe they understand human nature. They listen carefully to what others say. They trust explanations. They assume good intentions. Again and again, they find themselves shocked by people's behavior. Not because they are foolish, not because they lack intelligence, but because no one ever taught them how human behavior truly operates. This audiobook exists for exactly that reason. Human beings rarely reveal themselves directly. Instead, they expose themselves through repeated patterns, emotional reactions, silence, timing, hesitation, and the way they behave under pressure. The truth is simple, although many find it uncomfortable. Words often serve as performances. Behavior rarely lies. People naturally say what sounds appropriate. They say what protects their reputation. They say what keeps doors open and avoids conflict. But regardless of how carefully they choose their words, their actions quietly reveal what is actually true. You may hear sincerity in someone's voice, but you recognize sincerity through consistency. You may believe explanations for a while, but repeated behavior is what deserves your trust. Once you truly understand this principle, your entire perspective begins to change. You stop replaying conversations in your head. You stop wondering what hidden message you somehow missed. You stop blaming yourself for not being more intuitive. Because intuition is not some mysterious gift. It is simply observation that has been practiced long enough to become automatic. This audiobook is not designed to teach manipulation. It is not about controlling others, nor is it about becoming emotionally distant or suspicious of everyone around you. It is about developing clarity. It is about learning how to observe without projecting your own assumptions, how to listen without absorbing every emotion, how to see people as they actually are instead of who you wish they would become. Most misunderstandings are not created by bad intentions. They are created by assumptions. We assume others think the way we think. We assume they value what we value. We assume honesty is universal. But human behavior does not function according to assumptions. It is shaped by incentives, emotional needs, hidden fears, habits, and unconscious conditioning. The sooner you understand this reality, the calmer and safer your life becomes. There is a quiet strength that comes from understanding people. When you learn to read behavior, you stop searching endlessly for reassurance. When you recognize emotional patterns, you no longer chase explanations. When you pay attention to reactions instead of speeches, confusion gradually disappears. You stop asking, "Why would they do that?" Instead, you begin saying, "Now I understand why that happened." Not with bitterness, with awareness. Throughout this audiobook, you will explore the hidden mechanics behind the way people think, react, protect themselves, and unintentionally reveal their true nature. You will discover why emotional reactions often reveal more truth than carefully prepared explanations, why silence frequently communicates more than endless conversations, why pressure exposes character much faster than comfort ever can, and why the calm observer always notices what the emotionally reactive person completely overlooks. You will also face a deeper realization. The reason we often misjudge people is not only because of who they are, it is because of how our own minds work. We project our own values onto others. We fill empty spaces with hope. We interpret behavior through our personal expectations rather than objective observation. The moment you recognize this tendency, you gain something incredibly rare: the ability to step back instead of reacting instantly, the ability to observe instead of taking everything personally, the ability to understand instead of assuming, the ability to choose clarity over confusion. As you continue listening, resist the urge to rush forward. Allow each pattern to settle in your mind. Let every example remind you of experiences you've already lived through. This is not information meant to impress you with complexity. It is practical insight designed to protect you from unnecessary confusion. By the time this audiobook ends, you will no longer divide people into simple categories like good or bad. Instead, you will begin seeing behavior as something that follows recognizable patterns. And once behavior becomes predictable, emotional chaos begins losing its power over you. You no longer feel the need to control people. You no longer feel compelled to confront everyone. You no longer waste energy explaining yourself repeatedly. You simply learn to see clearly. And true power has always begun with one thing: quiet, steady, unshakable clarity. Chapter 1. Most people are performing, not simply being themselves. Most individuals genuinely believe they are expressing their authentic selves. They assume their personalities are completely genuine. They believe their opinions are entirely their own, and that their behavior reflects who they truly are. Yet if you slow down and observe people carefully, without judgment, without emotional bias, you begin noticing something surprisingly uncomfortable. Most people are not simply being, they are performing. From childhood onward, every human being quietly learns an invisible lesson that shapes nearly every future interaction. Acceptance often feels conditional. Approval appears to be something that must be earned. Belonging seems to require adjustment, so people adapt. They observe how others react. They experiment with different behaviors. They remember what earns praise and avoid whatever attracts rejection. Over time, these adjustments no longer feel temporary. They slowly become habits. Those habits gradually solidify into identity. As a result, what you often meet is not the person's authentic self. It is the version of themselves they believe the world expects to see. Every environment rewards a different performance. In the workplace, confidence is admired, even when it lacks substance. Inside relationships, constant agreeableness is often rewarded, even when honesty is sacrificed. Within social groups, humor, dominance, charm, or popularity become valuable forms of social currency. Naturally, people begin wearing masks. They change the way they speak depending on their audience. They soften opinions, magnify achievements, hide insecurities, adjust their posture, tone, facial expressions, and confidence according to the room they are standing in. This is not always manipulation. More often, it is survival. Human beings are profoundly social creatures, and social environments frequently punish authenticity whenever it threatens acceptance, harmony, or status. Because of this, many people unconsciously choose safety over truth. They would rather fit in than stand apart. They would rather be liked than genuinely understood. The problem is not that people wear masks. The real danger is forgetting that the mask should never be mistaken for the face. Why words are the weakest evidence? Whenever someone tells you who they are usually describing the image they hope others will believe. Words are intentional. Words are filtered. Words are carefully designed. People naturally explain themselves in ways that protect their identity. They describe intentions rather than consistent behavior. They tell stories that justify their choices rather than exposing recurring patterns. That is why relying only on words almost always creates confusion. The strength of quiet awareness. Many people spend an enormous amount of mental energy trying to understand others. They replay conversations over and over. They analyze every change in tone. They question whether they misunderstood something or judged a situation incorrectly. Yet the problem is rarely a lack of intelligence. More often, it is attention placed on the wrong things. The moment you shift your focus away from words and begin paying attention to behavior, much of that confusion begins to disappear. You stop trying to understand people only through what they say. Instead, you allow time, repetition, and consistency to uncover what carefully chosen words attempt to conceal. This shift does not make you emotionally distant. It makes you emotionally stable. You learn how to connect without creating illusions. You learn how to care without deceiving yourself. You begin trusting observation more than optimism. And in a world where so many people are constantly managing impressions, that level of awareness becomes incredibly uncommon. While most people remain busy performing for others, the quiet observer is simply paying attention. And genuine understanding, clear, calm, and free from emotional distortion, is the true foundation of reading people without allowing them to control your emotions. Chapter 2. Behavior reveals what words try to hide. Words are remarkably easy to shape. Behavior is not. If you want to understand people accurately, this may be one of the most valuable truths you can learn. Human beings speak with intention, whether consciously or unconsciously. They filter their words through fear, desire, reputation, personal identity, and self-protection. Behavior functions differently. Behavior grows out of habit. It appears naturally when conscious thinking fades and automatic conditioning takes over. That is exactly why behavior exposes what carefully crafted language attempts to hide. When someone tells you who they are offering a personal story. When someone repeatedly shows you who they are revealing a behavioral pattern, and patterns are far more reliable than promises. Many people mistakenly believe honesty exists primarily in language. They listen carefully to explanations, promises, apologies, and detailed justifications. They assume that enough conversation will eventually reveal the truth. Human psychology rarely works that way. The human mind possesses an extraordinary ability to justify behavior after it has already happened. Words often exist to reduce discomfort rather than expose reality. Behavior never argues. Behavior never explains. Behavior simply repeats itself. Someone may constantly claim to be too busy, yet somehow always finds time for what truly matters to them. Someone may repeatedly insist they care deeply while continuously postponing meaningful action. Someone may describe themselves as loyal, yet quietly disappear whenever loyalty demands sacrifice. None of these situations require complicated interpretation. They simply require careful observation. The space between words and actions. Perhaps the most revealing place in human psychology is the distance between what someone says and what they consistently do. That gap rarely appears by accident. It forms whenever intention collides with habit, whenever personal identity conflicts with conditioned behavior. Whenever desire encounters discomfort, people usually speak from the person they hope to become. They behave according to the person they have repeatedly practiced becoming. That single difference explains why words often sound convincing today, but feel disappointing months later. Language exists in the present moment. Behavior reveals itself across time. If your goal is to understand another person, stop paying attention to emotional intensity. Start paying attention to consistency. Intensity can easily be performed. Consistency almost never can. Excuses are psychological smoke. Whenever actions fail to match words, explanations quickly appear. Excuses are rarely random. They function like psychological smoke, drawing attention away from repeated behavior and redirecting it toward temporary circumstances. Most excuses sound perfectly reasonable. They appeal to compassion. They encourage understanding. They invite people to offer another chance. Once or twice, that kindness may absolutely be appropriate. But when explanations become permanent companions to recurring behavior, they stop functioning as explanations. They become evidence. Repeated excuses often reveal patterns without the speaker realizing it. A chronically late person will always have another reason. Someone unwilling to accept responsibility will always provide additional context. Someone who repeatedly violates boundaries will nearly always insist their intentions were good. The important question is never whether the explanation sounds believable. The important question is whether the behavior actually changes. If the behavior remains identical, the explanation has little practical value. Small behaviors reveal big truths. Most people search for dramatic warning signs, major betrayals, explosive arguments, obvious lies. Yet human nature often reveals itself much more honestly through tiny, ordinary behaviors. Small habits quietly communicate powerful truths. Notice how someone reacts when plans unexpectedly change. Notice how they respond to inconvenience. Notice what happens when they are not immediately praised, appreciated, or validated. Those ordinary moments reveal patience, entitlement, emotional maturity, gratitude, and respect far more accurately than any self-description ever could. People rarely deceive others through their daily habits. Habits develop gradually. They strengthen unconsciously. They reflect genuine priorities rather than carefully managed appearances. If someone genuinely values your presence, their actions naturally move closer to you. If they do not, distance slowly appears without any announcement. Why we ignore behavioral reality? Most people are perfectly capable of seeing behavior. Their real struggle is accepting what that behavior means. Behavior forces uncomfortable conclusions. Words preserve comforting possibilities. Accepting consistent behavior often means releasing imagined futures, releasing potential, releasing the version of someone we hoped would eventually appear. Because that process is emotionally painful, many people explain repeated behavior away. They assume confusion. They wait for another conversation. They ask for reassurance. They continue believing that the next discussion will finally bring actions and words into alignment. But alignment never comes from conversation alone. Alignment comes from choice, and every genuine choice eventually becomes visible through behavior. Reading without emotional attachment. Understanding another person's behavior does not require confrontation. You do not have to challenge every contradiction. You do not have to demand constant explanations. You do not have to expose every inconsistency. You simply need to notice. Observation is quiet. It happens internally. It does not create unnecessary conflict. It does not provoke defensiveness. Instead, it allows you to quietly adjust your expectations without feeling responsible for changing another person. This is where emotional intelligence becomes useful in everyday life. You stop reacting primarily to words. You begin responding to repeated behavior. Your boundaries become informed by actions. Your trust becomes guided by patterns. This approach does not make you emotionally detached. It makes your judgment more accurate. The freedom that comes from seeing clearly. The moment you begin valuing behavior more than carefully chosen words, confusion slowly loses its influence. You stop questioning your own perception. You stop chasing endless explanations. You stop making another person's inconsistency feel like your personal failure. Instead, you simply see reality. Some people remain dependable regardless of circumstances. Some people behave differently depending on convenience. Some people can only be trusted when nothing difficult is required of them. These observations do not require bitterness. They require awareness. And awareness creates freedom. Freedom from unrealistic expectations, freedom from emotional instability, freedom from persuasive speeches that repeated behavior never confirms. Words may inspire people, words may comfort people, but behavior quietly tells the truth, even when no one intends to reveal it. And once you learn to recognize that truth calmly, patiently, and without resistance, people no longer leave you confused. You begin understanding them. Chapter 3. Emotional reactions reveal inner truth. People often reveal far more about themselves during a single emotional moment than they do through hours of carefully prepared explanations. The reason is simple. Emotional reactions are rarely rehearsed. They appear before the mind has enough time to edit, polish, or protect its public image. For just a few brief seconds, anger, jealousy, fear, defensiveness, embarrassment, or insecurity expose the invisible structure beneath the personality. Emotion is not weakness. Emotion is information. Unfortunately, most people evaluate emotions morally instead of psychologically. They immediately label reactions as appropriate or inappropriate, good or bad. A far more useful question is this: what is this emotional reaction trying to protect? Every emotional response exists to defend something happening internally. When someone becomes intensely angry, something personally meaningful has been threatened. When someone instantly becomes defensive, a fragile identity has been touched. When someone emotionally withdraws, fear of rejection, exposure, or loss is often operating beneath the surface. These reactions never emerge randomly. They point directly toward unresolved emotional vulnerabilities. Why emotional reactions matter more than calm explanations. Calm statements are carefully managed. Emotional reactions are spontaneous. When someone calmly explains their values, they describe the person they wish others to see. When they react emotionally without preparation, they often reveal what genuinely matters to them. A person who confidently claims complete self-assurance but reacts harshly to criticism is often protecting hidden insecurity. Someone who insists they no longer care, yet becomes jealous, is revealing emotional attachment. Someone who repeatedly claims complete honesty while reacting defensively to simple questions is usually protecting a personal narrative. Emotional intensity almost always signals psychological importance. The stronger the emotional response, the closer you are to something deeply significant within that person's inner world. This never means you should intentionally provoke people simply to test them. Life naturally provides enough disappointment, disagreement, uncertainty, and pressure. Your responsibility is simply to observe how people respond when those moments arrive. Triggers are psychological signposts. An emotional trigger is never random. It functions like a signpost pointing towards something unresolved. Whenever an ordinary comment, delayed response, healthy boundary, or simple disagreement produces a reaction far larger than the situation itself, something deeper has been activated. Very often, the person is no longer reacting only to the present moment. They are responding to emotional wounds that have existed long before this conversation ever began. This is why emotional reactions often feel bigger than the situation. This is exactly why emotional responses sometimes appear completely out of proportion to what actually happened. The event itself may seem minor, yet the emotional reaction is overwhelming. Once you understand this principle, you stop taking every emotional response personally. You recognize that another person's reaction usually tells you far more about their internal world than it does about you. Their emotion belongs to their experience, not yours. Defensiveness protects identity. Defensiveness is one of the clearest emotional indicators a person can display. A defensive individual is rarely protecting objective truth. More often, they are protecting the image they hold of themselves. When someone cannot tolerate being questioned, corrected, or gently challenged, it usually suggests that their sense of identity depends upon a particular story remaining intact. That story provides psychological stability. Anything that threatens it immediately feels unsafe. This is why defensiveness frequently appears as anger, sarcasm, dismissal, excessive explanation, blame shifting, or emotional resistance. The real objective is not resolving the disagreement. The objective is restoring internal emotional comfort. Whenever you encounter defensiveness, you are standing at the boundary of someone's self-concept. Anger reveals where control has been lost. Anger is commonly mistaken for strength. In reality, anger often reflects the opposite. It usually appears when someone feels they are losing control. People become angry whenever something they depend upon feels threatened. It may be their authority, their status, their predictability, their need for validation, their dominance, or simply the respect they believe they deserve. Anger attempts to regain control over situations that suddenly feel uncertain or threatening. This explains why anger frequently appears the moment healthy boundaries are established. Someone who reacts with hostility toward a reasonable boundary often reveals entitlement. Someone who explodes simply because another person disagrees is often exposing deep insecurity rather than confidence. Emotionally secure individuals rarely need intimidation. Genuinely confident people rarely need to overpower others. Anger quietly points toward the places where someone secretly feels powerless. Withdrawal speaks just as loudly as outbursts. Not every emotional response arrives with raised voices or visible conflict. Some people simply disappear. They become silent. They emotionally shut down. Withdrawal is often a coping strategy learned very early in life. It develops as protection against rejection, conflict, shame, or emotional pain. Whenever emotions begin feeling overwhelming or unsafe, the nervous system creates distance. This response usually communicates fear rather than indifference. Someone who withdraws instead of communicating often fears emotional exposure more than they lack emotional depth. Once again, repeated behavior tells a far more accurate story than carefully prepared explanations ever can. Observing emotional truth without becoming reactive. The secret to understanding emotional reactions is maintaining emotional distance. Not physical distance, inner distance. You do not need to argue. You do not need to defend yourself. You do not need to match another person's emotional intensity. Your task is simply to observe. Notice what triggered the response. Notice how intense it became. Notice whether it disappeared quickly or continued for hours or days. Over time, emotional patterns begin revealing themselves naturally. Some individuals react explosively yet recover within minutes. Others remain outwardly calm while quietly holding resentment for long periods. Some swing repeatedly between emotional extremes. These recurring patterns reveal how emotionally stable, predictable, and psychologically safe someone truly is. The gift of emotional awareness. Once you learn how to read emotional reactions accurately, confusion gradually disappears. Instead of asking, "Why would they behave that way?" you begin asking, "What is this emotional reaction protecting?" That single shift changes everything. It gives you choice. You decide how emotionally close to become. You decide how much of yourself to share. You decide which behaviors deserve your attention and which deserve healthy distance. Emotions stop controlling your interpretation. Instead, they become valuable information, quiet, accurate, revealing. And through that awareness, people become clearer than words alone could ever make them. Chapter 4. Silence speaks louder than words. Most people struggle with silence. Whenever conversation pauses, they instinctively rush to fill the empty space. They explain. They joke. They reassure. They overtalk. They create noise simply to avoid discomfort. Silence often feels exposing because it removes the protection that words provide and turns attention inward. That discomfort alone demonstrates how powerful silence truly is. Silence is never empty. Silence communicates. Within human behavior, what remains unsaid frequently reveals more than everything that is spoken aloud. Words can always be rehearsed, edited, filtered, carefully designed. Silence carries no script. Instead, it exposes hesitation, uncertainty, avoidance, confidence, intention, without requiring a single sentence. Once you learn how to observe silence, you begin understanding people at a level that ordinary conversation rarely reaches. Silence removes the performance speech, gives people opportunities to perform. Silence quietly removes the stage. When conversation stops, there are no immediate explanations available. No carefully chosen charm, no rapid defense, no opportunity to manage perception. What remains is posture, facial expression, body language, timing, breathing, and emotional reaction. Some individuals remain completely comfortable inside silence. Others immediately become restless. They over-explain. They grow anxious. They begin filling every empty moment with unnecessary words. This difference is meaningful. Comfort with silence usually reflects inner stability. Discomfort often reveals dependence upon validation, reassurance, or control. People who constantly need to speak are frequently trying to influence how others perceive them. Silence interrupts that effort. The moment you remain quiet, the other person's nervous system begins revealing itself naturally. Stop managing perception. The moment you become comfortable with silence, something profound begins to change inside you. You stop trying to control how others see you. You stop offering explanations that no one asked for. You stop reacting impulsively simply to remove discomfort. Instead, you become an observer. Silence creates emotional security because it allows you to protect your own energy. You no longer rush to repair misunderstandings that were never your responsibility to solve. You stop stretching yourself just to keep everyone else comfortable. You stop volunteering endless explanations simply to calm another person's anxiety. Instead, you allow moments to speak for themselves. This changes the emotional balance of every interaction. You are no longer carrying the entire conversation. Responsibility remains shared. And within that shared space, clarity naturally emerges. The quiet observer's advantage. A person who is genuinely comfortable with silence always notices more than someone who constantly fills every pause with words. They recognize subtle facial expressions. They observe tiny emotional reactions. They notice shifts in posture. They detect uncertainty. They recognize confidence. Because their attention is not consumed by constant speaking, they become far more aware of what is quietly unfolding beneath the surface. This does not make them emotionally distant. It makes them fully present. Silence naturally slows human interaction. And whenever interaction slows, truth has room to emerge. In a world overflowing with endless conversation, notifications, opinions, and constant noise, remaining comfortably silent has become an uncommon ability. And uncommon abilities create uncommon advantages. Silence never demands attention, it quietly earns it. Once you truly understand this, you begin hearing messages that spoken words could never communicate. Chapter 5. The way people treat others is the way they will eventually treat you. One of the most reliable ways to understand another person's character has very little to do with the way they currently treat you. Instead, pay attention to how they behave toward people who cannot offer them anything in return. This is where performance fades and genuine character quietly appears. Whenever someone hopes to gain approval, opportunity, affection, comfort, or advantage from you, they often display their very best behavior. They become attentive, patient, generous, supportive, thoughtful. That version of them feels genuine because it has been created intentionally. But intention rarely lasts forever. Once there is nothing left to gain, behavior naturally returns to its default pattern. Notice how someone treats servers, assistants, employees, former friends, strangers, family members, people beneath them in status, or anyone who no longer serves a useful purpose. Those interactions reveal more about someone's true character than almost any conversation they have with you, because in those moments, there is no audience worth impressing, no reward waiting at the end, no reason to perform. Courtesy is sometimes conditional. Many people appear polite, not because kindness has become part of their character, but because politeness serves their interests. They understand exactly when courtesy improves their image. They know when patience will be noticed. They recognize when self-control protects their reputation. But watch carefully when those incentives disappear. Does respect remain even when nobody important is watching? Does patience survive inconvenience? Does empathy continue when power becomes unequal? Moments like these remove every reason to perform. Someone who remains respectful regardless of circumstance is revealing genuine character. Someone who shows kindness only when it benefits them is revealing calculation. Calculation is not automatically cruel, but it is deeply revealing. The illusion of they're different with me. One of the easiest emotional traps to fall into is believing someone behaves differently specifically because of your relationship. People often say, they're not like that with me. You haven't seen the version of them that I know. Sometimes this appears true. Human beings absolutely adjust their behavior depending on the relationship, but adjustment should never be mistaken for transformation. If someone repeatedly dismisses people, manipulates them, avoids accountability, belittles others, or consistently disrespects boundaries, those patterns exist independently of how they currently behave toward you. Perhaps you simply have not reached the situation that activates them. Time eventually does, comfort eventually does, stress eventually does, familiarity eventually does. Character does not fundamentally change because of closeness. It simply reveals itself more completely over time. Listen carefully to how people talk about others. Pay close attention whenever someone discusses people who are not present. Do they consistently speak with contempt? Do they ridicule another person's weaknesses? Do they portray themselves as the innocent victim in every story? The way someone explains other people's behavior reveals the psychological lens through which they interpret the world. Someone who constantly criticizes others is quietly practicing the story they may eventually tell about you. Someone who freely violates another person's privacy will eventually violate yours as well. Someone who casually shares private secrets rarely develops discretion overnight. Comparison reveals internal conflict. Emotionally secure people naturally notice differences between themselves and others, but those differences do not threaten their sense of worth. Their confidence remains intact. Insecure individuals experience comparison very differently. Their attention constantly moves towards status, recognition, achievement, approval. They quietly measure where they stand against everyone around them. Another person's success feels personal. Another person's recognition feels like their own loss. This internal struggle often leaks into subtle behavior. They minimize another person's accomplishments, redirect conversations back toward themselves, dismiss achievements they secretly admire, mock qualities they privately wish they possessed. These reactions are rarely intentional. They function as emotional self-protection. Insecurity transforms another person's success into a mirror, and not everyone feels comfortable with the reflection staring back at them. Overreaction is never random. Another common way insecurity becomes visible is through emotional overreaction. Simple feedback immediately produces defensiveness. Healthy boundaries trigger anger. Ordinary disagreement creates hostility or emotional withdrawal. These reactions are rarely about the event itself. They are about what the event touches internally. An exaggerated emotional response usually signals that something deeply connected to identity has been threatened. Perhaps self-worth, perhaps reputation, perhaps the story someone tells themselves about who they are. Emotionally secure people can experience discomfort without falling apart. Insecure people often experience discomfort as danger. That single difference shapes nearly every interaction they have. Why insecurity is mistaken for strength. Many environments unintentionally reward insecure behavior. Volume is mistaken for confidence. Absolute certainty is mistaken for intelligence. Dominance is mistaken for leadership. Forcefulness is mistaken for authority. For a while, these qualities may appear impressive, but sustained pressure exposes the difference. People driven by insecurity often struggle with accountability. Constructive criticism feels threatening. Responsibility is shifted elsewhere. Protecting appearance becomes more important than genuine growth. Real strength behaves differently. It does not fear being examined. It welcomes learning. It survives honesty. Because true strength never depends upon protecting an image. Observe without judging. Recognizing insecurity does not require criticism. It requires emotional neutrality. There is no need to diagnose, no need to confront, no need to label anyone. Simply observe recurring patterns. Does this person constantly seek approval? Do they become uncomfortable when questioned? Do small challenges create disproportionate emotional reactions? Do they require continual reassurance? These observations help you understand how much emotional stability exists inside the relationship. You stop expecting emotional consistency from someone whose emotions are consistently unstable. You stop expecting humility from someone still defending their ego. That is not judgment. It is realistic observation. Compassion does not eliminate boundaries. Insecurity often develops from painful experiences. Rejection, neglect, instability, early emotional wounds. Recognizing this naturally creates compassion. But compassion should never erase wisdom. Understanding another person's pain does not require placing yourself inside it. You can empathize without becoming responsible. You can care without becoming vulnerable to repeated harm. Healthy boundaries are never punishment. They are protection. The quiet strength of emotional security. The more emotionally secure you become, the easier it becomes to notice insecurity without absorbing it. You no longer mirror another person's emotional intensity. You stop competing for recognition. You lose interest in proving your worth. You remain steady. That steadiness quietly disarms insecurity because insecure behavior depends upon emotional participation. Most importantly, emotional security allows you to see clearly. Because insecurity always leaves traces, it always leaks through behavior. And once you recognize those recurring patterns, actions that once felt confusing suddenly begin making sense. You stop reacting to the noise. You begin understanding the signal underneath it. That understanding gives you something far more valuable than control over others. It gives you control over your own response. Chapter 7. People reveal their true nature. Under pressure. Pressure accomplishes something comfort never can. It removes rehearsal. It weakens performance. It exposes priorities. When life is comfortable, almost anyone can maintain an attractive image. Patience appears effortless. Generosity feels natural. Composure seems permanent. Kindness costs very little. But everything changes once pressure arrives. Deadlines become urgent. Conflict appears. Plans fail. Loss occurs. Uncertainty grows. At that moment, the nervous system begins leading behavior, and behavior becomes remarkably honest. Pressure never creates character. It simply reveals what has been there all along. That is why the clearest understanding of another person never comes during comfortable conversations. It comes during difficult moments. Pressure changes the brain. Under pressure, the brain shifts from thoughtful reflection toward automatic reaction. There is less time to manage impressions, less mental energy available to filter responses. The mind immediately falls back on what it has practiced repeatedly. Habit, conditioning, instinct. Some people naturally become calm, focused, and decisive. Others become rigid and defensive. Some withdraw, some become controlling, some create unnecessary conflict. These responses usually are not conscious decisions made in the moment. They are deeply learned behavioral patterns, and because they have been practiced repeatedly, they tend to appear again and again whenever pressure returns. Stress reveals. Emotional maturity. Emotional maturity is never measured by how someone behaves when everything is easy. Its real measure appears when expectations collapse, when plans fail, when disappointment arrives. Notice what happens. Do they accept responsibility or immediately search for someone else to blame? Do they communicate honestly or disappear completely? Do they regulate their own emotions or spread emotional chaos to everyone nearby? Emotionally mature individuals certainly experience stress, but they carry much of it internally while managing it responsibly. Emotionally immature individuals often externalize their stress. They project frustration onto other people, create unnecessary conflict, demand reassurance, spread anxiety throughout the environment. Stress quietly reveals whether someone can carry discomfort without handing that discomfort to everyone around them. Pressure tests values, not promises. Almost everyone speaks confidently about values: integrity, respect, loyalty, responsibility, accountability. Yet values are never proven by speech. They become visible only when living by them requires sacrifice. Pressure creates that sacrifice. Under stress, people repeatedly choose between comfort and principle, between convenience and responsibility, between honesty and self-protection. These decisions may appear small: avoiding a difficult conversation, cutting ethical corners, blaming someone else, ignoring commitments. Yet repeated small choices become lasting behavioral patterns. And patterns formed under pressure reveal trustworthiness far more accurately than any promise ever could. The advantage of remaining calm. Remaining calm during moments of pressure gives you something that panic never can. It gives you clarity. When everyone around you begins reacting emotionally, calmness creates contrast. And contrast makes hidden behavior visible. You begin noticing who immediately panics, who starts manipulating situations, who remains emotionally steady, who takes responsibility, and who quietly loses control. Staying calm does not mean suppressing your emotions or pretending they do not exist. It simply means refusing to let emotion become the force that directs your behavior. The calm observer never absorbs the surrounding chaos. Instead, they observe it carefully, they study it, they learn from it. What pressure ultimately reveals. Pressure exposes who people become once comfort disappears, not the version they describe, not the version they display when everything is going well, but the version that naturally appears once certainty fades and control begins slipping away. When you understand this principle, Your expectations become far more realistic. You stop being shocked when someone falls apart. You stop feeling disappointed by repeated avoidance. You stop searching for explanations every time inconsistency appears. Instead, you begin recognizing the structure beneath the surface. Pressure quietly removes every carefully constructed mask. What remains is the person you are genuinely dealing with. That knowledge, steady, grounded, accurate, allows you to move through relationships with clarity instead of illusion. And clarity maintained under pressure is one of the greatest forms of personal power. Chapter 8. Why you keep misjudging people. Most people assume they misunderstand others simply because they lacked enough information. They tell themselves, if only I had known more. If only they had explained themselves better. If only I had asked different questions. But misunderstanding rarely begins with missing information. It begins with distorted perception. Human perception is never completely objective. Every observation passes through emotional filters: memory, hope, fear, personal experience, personal values. Unless you become aware of those filters, you will continue seeing people not as they truly are, but as your own mind quietly reshapes them. Projection, seeing yourself inside other people. One of the strongest distortions is projection. Projection happens whenever you assume another person's inner world works the same way yours does. You interpret their behavior through your own values instead of theirs. If honesty comes naturally to you, you automatically expect honesty from others. If loyalty matters deeply to you, you assume others value loyalty equally. If you communicate directly, you expect similar openness in return. At first, this feels perfectly reasonable. It feels human. Yet it is also one of the fastest ways to misunderstand another person. Projection feels comforting because it creates the illusion that everyone lives according to the same invisible rules. Reality rarely works that way. Human behavior follows personal conditioning rather than universal morality. People are not wrong simply because they are different, but assuming similarity where none exists can become deeply costly. Hope is not the same as perception. Another powerful source of misjudgment is hope. Hope naturally fills uncertainty with possibility. It interprets unclear situations generously. It postpones difficult conclusions. It transforms recurring patterns into isolated exceptions. Hope quietly whispers, they didn't really mean it. They'll eventually change. This time will be different. Hope itself is not foolish. Hope simply reflects emotional investment. Whenever you deeply desire a relationship, an outcome, or a particular version of another person, your perception slowly bends toward that desire. Behavior contradicting your expectations becomes easier to ignore. Words supporting your hopes suddenly become louder than actions. Because hope feels optimistic, most people never question it. They mistake it for kindness, optimism, emotional depth. Yet hope functions exactly like a lens, and every lens changes what you see. Familiar pain feels surprisingly safe. People also misjudge others because the familiar often feels safer than the healthy. The human mind naturally moves toward what it recognizes: experiences from childhood, past relationships, early emotional conditioning, create internal blueprints. Whenever someone resembles those familiar patterns, they automatically feel comfortable. Even if those familiar patterns include disappointment, neglect, emotional inconsistency, or instability. That explains why people sometimes continue trusting individuals who repeatedly let them down. At the very same time, they remain suspicious of those who consistently behave with reliability. Predictable pain feels familiar. Healthy consistency often feels unfamiliar, and unfamiliarity naturally creates caution. This leads to one of the greatest emotional tragedies. Reliable people become undervalued. Unreliable people continue receiving endless chances. Over-explaining is often a warning sign. Another distortion appears whenever you spend more time explaining behavior than simply observing it. Explaining feels intelligent, compassionate, thoughtful. Yet constant explanation often signals resistance toward accepting what repeated behavior is already revealing. Whenever you find yourself endlessly analyzing, justifying, providing context, or creating reasons for someone else's repeated actions, pause for a moment. Ask yourself a simple question. Why doesn't observation alone feel enough? Truth rarely requires endless interpretation. Behavior that consistently matches words creates very little confusion. Behavior that repeatedly contradicts words creates endless explanations. And explanation is exactly where misjudgment quietly grows. Emotional attachment distorts reality. The stronger your emotional attachment becomes, the more difficult objective observation becomes. Attachment naturally creates bias. Positive qualities become larger, negative qualities become smaller. Repeated inconsistency suddenly feels like emotional complexity. Pain becomes misunderstanding. This is not weakness. It is simply how the human nervous system protects connection. Maintaining important relationships often feels psychologically safer than confronting uncomfortable truth, so the mind unconsciously adjusts perception in order to preserve attachment. This is exactly why emotional distance restores clarity, not emotional coldness. Simply enough space to observe reality without desperately needing a particular outcome. The desire to be the exception. Many misunderstandings are quietly driven by a hidden emotional desire. The desire to be chosen, to be different, to be special, to become the one person treated better than everyone else. That desire can easily overpower evidence. When someone consistently mistreats others but behaves kindly toward you, it feels deeply validating. It seems to confirm your value. The mind naturally wants to preserve that feeling, even when repeated patterns clearly suggest otherwise. Yet being chosen by someone emotionally unstable does not create safety. It simply means that for now, you remain useful. Usefulness should never be mistaken for security. Correcting perception without becoming cynical. Improving perception does not require becoming suspicious of everyone. It requires slowing down, separating observable behavior from personal interpretation, separating repeated patterns from comforting explanations, separating evidence from emotion. Rather than constantly asking, what did they really mean? Ask, what do they repeatedly do? Instead of wondering, why did this happen? Ask, how often does this happen? Those questions quietly move your attention away from interpretation and back toward observation. Clarity is a discipline. Seeing people accurately is not a mysterious talent reserved for naturally intuitive individuals. It is a discipline of observing without filling empty spaces, of noticing without rescuing, of allowing reality to remain exactly as it is, even when reality disappoints you. The moment projection fades, hope stops distorting perception, and emotional bias begins losing its influence. Something inside you becomes remarkably steady. You stop misunderstanding people, not because they changed, but because your perception finally became accurate, and accurate perception creates peace. Confusion was never caused by people being impossibly complicated. It was created by seeing them through emotional filters that were never objective. Once those filters gradually disappear, people become surprisingly easy to understand, not because human beings are simple, but because consistent behavior, when observed clearly, almost never lies. Chapter 9. How to read people without becoming emotionally cold. One quiet fear often appears as people begin understanding human behavior more deeply. They wonder, if I learn to see too much, will I stop feeling? If I understand people clearly, will I become distant? Will I lose warmth? Will I become emotionally guarded? Those concerns are understandable, but they are based on a misunderstanding. Clarity never requires emotional coldness. Awareness never demands withdrawal. In reality, the opposite happens. Once you stop constantly misunderstanding people, your emotional life becomes calmer, more stable, more grounded. Instead of reacting automatically, you begin choosing your responses consciously. The false choice between empathy and awareness. Many people believe empathy and clear perception cannot exist together. They imagine they must sacrifice one to keep the other. They think, if I notice someone's flaws, I won't remain compassionate. If I recognize unhealthy patterns, kindness will disappear. Yet genuine emotional intelligence requires both. Empathy without awareness slowly becomes self-sacrifice. Awareness without empathy slowly becomes emotional detachment. The objective is neither emotional distance nor blind compassion. The real objective is balanced understanding. You can acknowledge another person's limitations without growing resentful toward them. You can recognize their emotional wounds without stepping inside those wounds yourself. You can observe their behavior with complete clarity without turning every observation into criticism or judgment. This quiet balance is something emotionally mature people slowly develop through experience. Why coldness is often a protective response. Emotional coldness rarely comes from understanding people too well. More often, it develops after someone has been hurt repeatedly while lacking clarity. When people experience betrayal, confusion, or emotional exhaustion over and over again, they instinctively protect themselves by shutting down. They become distant, not because they suddenly understand people better, but because they entered relationships without healthy boundaries and paid the price. Learning human behavior correctly prevents that cycle. It allows you to recognize unhealthy patterns early, long before emotional damage begins to accumulate. Learning to see without carrying. Perhaps the most valuable skill in reading people is learning separation. Separating another person's emotions from your responsibility. Separating another person's struggles from your obligation to solve them. Separating what someone reveals from what you are willing to tolerate. Understanding another person's behavior does not require carrying the weight of that behavior. You can recognize insecurity without adjusting yourself to accommodate it. You can identify manipulation without participating in it. You can notice emotional instability without allowing yourself to become emotionally entangled. That is not emotional coldness. It is emotional containment. Boundaries are acts of respect, not rejection. Many people mistakenly believe boundaries communicate rejection. They assume that setting limits means withholding affection, kindness, or respect. The reality is exactly the opposite. Healthy boundaries are what allow kindness to exist without eventually becoming resentment. When you begin reading people accurately, your sense of closeness naturally adjusts. You stop sharing your deepest thoughts with someone who repeatedly gossips. You stop depending on people who consistently avoid responsibility. You stop searching for reassurance from individuals who never offer consistency. None of these adjustments are acts of cruelty. They are demonstrations of emotional intelligence. You simply relate to people according to who they repeatedly show themselves to be. Nothing more, nothing less. Compassion without illusion. Real compassion always rests upon reality. It never requires pretending someone is different from who they consistently demonstrate themselves to be. It never asks you to ignore destructive patterns. It never expects endless patience without personal accountability. Compassion quietly says, I understand who you are, and I will choose my level of closeness accordingly. Illusion whispers, I'll believe whatever feels less painful right now. Illusions eventually collapse beneath reality. Compassion survives because it begins with reality. Releasing the need to rescue. Everyone. One of the greatest freedoms that comes from understanding human behavior is letting go of the need to fix other people. When you misunderstand behavior, you naturally believe that one honest conversation, one more effort, one deeper expression of love, will permanently transform someone's patterns. But accurate observation teaches something different. It teaches you what is stable and what is unlikely to change. You stop negotiating with reality. You stop pouring emotional energy into improbable outcomes. You stop confusing someone's potential with the probability of actual change. That perspective does not make you cynical. It simply makes your energy more intentional. Remaining warm without becoming available to everyone. Being emotionally warm does not require unlimited openness. You can remain genuinely kind without exposing every vulnerable part of yourself. You can stay emotionally present without becoming permissive. You can listen carefully without inviting every influence into your inner world. Warmth is an inner quality. It is not the absence of healthy boundaries. People who appear emotionally cold often never learned how to regulate closeness. Instead, they move between complete overexposure and complete withdrawal. Understanding human behavior allows you to remain steady somewhere in between. The calm that comes from accuracy. Once projection fades, once endless explanations disappear, once hope stops arguing against repeated evidence, something inside you becomes remarkably quiet. You stop feeling emotionally pulled in every direction. You stop believing you are responsible for managing everyone else's emotional state. You stop being surprised by patterns that once left you confused. This calmness is not emotional indifference. It is simple alignment with reality. And alignment naturally creates peace. Choosing relationships instead of obligation. Understanding people gives you something incredibly valuable. Choice. You choose closeness where mutual effort exists. You choose distance wherever protection becomes necessary. You choose patience when it has been earned rather than demanded. That is the difference between emotional maturity and emotional exhaustion. You are no longer responding to imagined versions of people. You respond to the consistent patterns they actually demonstrate. By doing so, you remain emotionally open without becoming emotionally unprotected. That is not coldness, that is wisdom. Chapter 10. The calm observer holds the greatest power. Most people believe power comes through influence, control, or dominance. They assume the strongest individual is the loudest voice in the room, the fastest mover, the person demanding constant attention. Real psychological power operates according to entirely different rules. It is quiet, it is steady, and it belongs to the individual capable of observing without immediately reacting. The calm observer possesses an advantage not because they manipulate people, but because they refuse to become emotionally manipulated themselves. Every reaction reveals something. Each impulsive reaction gives away valuable information. It reveals what affects you emotionally. It exposes where your boundaries remain fragile. It uncovers what you desperately need. Many reactive people believe they are simply expressing authenticity. In reality, they are allowing external events to control their internal state. The easier someone can provoke your emotions, the easier they can influence your direction. The calm observer does not eliminate emotion. Instead, they create space before responding. And inside that space, choice becomes possible. Why observation creates real leverage. Observation allows understanding before engagement. Rather than reacting to isolated incidents, you begin responding to repeated patterns, instead of becoming swept away by someone's tone, intensity, or emotional display. You anchor your judgment in consistency over time. That shift gives you leverage, not leverage over another person, but leverage over the situation itself. You avoid committing too quickly. You avoid unnecessary escalation. You avoid revealing more than circumstances require. Instead, you remain composed while allowing others to gradually reveal themselves. That quiet steadiness becomes one of your greatest strengths. The objective is not to become emotionally detached, nor is it to remain endlessly vulnerable. The real objective is to develop grounded understanding. You can acknowledge another person's limitations without allowing resentment to grow inside you. You can recognize the wounds they carry without stepping into those wounds yourself. You can observe someone's behavior with complete clarity without immediately turning that observation into criticism or judgment. This quiet balance is something emotionally mature people cultivate over years of experience. Why emotional coldness is often a protective shield. People rarely become emotionally cold because they understand others too well. More often, coldness develops after repeated experiences of confusion, disappointment, betrayal, or emotional exhaustion. When someone is hurt again and again without understanding why, the mind eventually protects itself by shutting down. Instead of setting healthy boundaries, they disconnect entirely. They become distant, not because they suddenly gained wisdom, but because they remained exposed for too long without protection. Learning how human behavior actually works prevents this cycle. Instead of waiting until damage has already accumulated, you recognize patterns early. You adjust your expectations before emotional exhaustion takes hold. Awareness protects long before withdrawal becomes necessary. Learning to see without carrying everything. One of the most valuable skills in understanding people is learning the difference between observation and absorption. There is a clear separation between what another person feels and what you are responsible for carrying, between the struggles they experience and the problems you must solve, between what they reveal about themselves and what you are willing to tolerate in your own life. Understanding someone does not obligate you to absorb their emotional world. You can recognize insecurity without constantly reassuring it. You can notice manipulation without participating in its game. You can identify emotional instability without allowing yourself to be pulled into its turbulence. None of this makes you emotionally cold. It simply means you have developed healthy emotional containment. Boundaries are expressions of wisdom, not rejection. Many people misunderstand boundaries because they associate them with rejection. They believe setting limits means becoming uncaring, distant, or disrespectful. The reality is exactly the opposite. Healthy boundaries are what make genuine care sustainable. Without them, kindness slowly transforms into resentment. When you accurately understand someone's behavioral patterns, your distance naturally adjusts. You stop oversharing with people who repeatedly gossip. You stop depending on those who consistently avoid responsibility. You stop searching for reassurance from people who never provide consistency. These decisions are not acts of emotional cruelty. They are signs of emotional intelligence. You simply meet people where they consistently demonstrate they are capable of meeting you, no higher and no lower. Compassion. Without living inside. Illusion. Real compassion is rooted firmly in reality. It does not ask you to pretend someone is different from who they repeatedly show themselves to be. It does not require ignoring harmful patterns simply to preserve hope. It does not demand endless patience while accountability remains absent. True compassion quietly says, "I understand who you are, and with that understanding, I will choose the appropriate level of closeness." Illusion whispers something different. "I'll believe the version that hurts less today." Illusions eventually collapse beneath reality. Genuine compassion survives because it is built on truth rather than fantasy. Releasing the burden of fixing. Everyone. Perhaps one of the greatest freedoms that comes from understanding human behavior is letting go of the belief that everyone can be changed through enough effort. When people misunderstand others, they often believe transformation is just one meaningful conversation away. They assume greater love, deeper understanding, or more patience will eventually change long-established behavioral patterns. But accurate observation teaches something different. It shows you what is stable and what is temporary. It shows you which behaviors repeat regardless of explanation. Gradually, you stop negotiating with reality. You stop pouring energy into outcomes that consistently refuse to change. You stop confusing someone's potential with the probability of that potential ever becoming reality. This shift does not make you pessimistic, it makes you emotionally efficient.